First up today, we have Ross. So Ross is a product manager, free agent, and he cites his main interests as beer and chess. That's a solid. I don't think you need anything else in your life, to be honest, Ross. So congratulations to you for picking the best two interests. And Ross is going to share 5 Things from Ordinary Men by Christopher Browning. Ross.
Oh, thank you, Andy. And thank you for the caveat about not knowing much about the subject matter, because I think that was targeted very much towards myself.
Not at all.
So Ordinary Men. I read Ordinary Men last year, last September, and it's one of the books there. I really hope I can do it some form of justice. It's a very, very dense book, but has made a profound impact on me since reading it. The book is really kind of consists of it's really a book of two halves. The first half is really recalling kind of the events of Reserve Police Battalion 101 from 1941 to 1942, almost written as if it was like a history kind of PhD kind of thesis. So it's very dense, quite tricky to read, full of facts. The second half, of this version at least, provides an opinion and kind of commentary as to why kind of these events occurred, and it's really in that latter half do you kind of uncover some pretty fascinating things. Now the book is, as I said, very records a lot of events in that first half. I'm going to try and condense it to kind of the initial stages of the book. So as I said, the book kind of recalls these events of this police battalion. Now it's interesting the way in which the police, the German police, were kind of set up at the time. There were two branches, and one of the branches is called the Order Police. The Order Police were kind of separate from the army, and often had people that didn't want to take part in the war, and instead kind of signed up to this Reserve Police. The Reserve Police Battalion 101 in particular consisted of members that were quite old. So these people that were drafted into the army and then didn't meet the criteria. So often they were in their 40s or in their 50s. And so these were people who their normal days were like bakers. They were welders. They were doing all sorts of normal jobs. And it's important to note their age, because they weren't indoctrinated in Nazism. They didn't go through kind of the Hitler Youth or anything like that. So these were very much, as the title says, kind of ordinary men. And so these men were initially, this police battalion were initially tasked with patrolling Poland, actually, and trying to maintain some form of peace and order. And there they actually observed some of the acts of the army as well, which are obviously some horrific acts that took place. And then they were first, the point which I want to focus on with all the 5 things that I've learned from this book were around the first acts that these police battalion undertook. And this is when they were asked to. So, do you mind moving on to the first thing? Is that okay? They were first asked to start to move Jewish people from Polish villages into the towns, into the ghettos. And this is probably the first point in which you think there is some kind of very unreasonable and inhumane ask of people. And this is the first thing that I've learned from this book, is that questioning authority is really reasonable and necessary. It's not just for conspiracy theorists, and particularly in this type of climate. I realize this is maybe a controversial statement, but it's very, very important to question authority. Doesn't mean you shouldn't be unreasonable yourself, but questioning some orders that have come from above that in your gut feels wrong should be investigated and should really be thought out first. So as I said, excuse me. So that they so they were tasked with moving these people out of these villages. Unfortunately, it was then that their major then gave them an order, and their order had come, as I said, from high up, and it was, you must separate out the men, and the men will go into will go to work camps, but it's the women and children, it's the elderly that you must shoot and kill and execute. And it's interesting that it was tasked to these ordinary people to do these horrific acts. Excuse me, I almost get choked up thinking about it. And it really moves on to the second thing, is that these people were asked to do things in kind of increasingly small rational steps, it appeared at least. And these people, so it started off, as I said, kind of focused on the sick and old, to execute the sick and old, because the reason was that while these people had to be moved, and the most humane thing you could possibly do would be to execute them. So these men thought, well, you know, this is the most inhumane thing to do, so I shall do it. And then it stepped up. It then became, well, you should then execute the younger women, and then execute the children. And here's a quote which really kind of stuck with me. And here's the quote: "I reasoned with myself that after all, without its mother, the child could not live any longer. It was supposed to be, so to speak, soothing to my conscience to release children unable to live." Now, it's very interesting because these men, it wasn't necessarily forcing them to commit these acts. These acts were optional. They had the option to say no, and they would be then brought back into Germany, into a different police battalion. But instead, they all chose to do these acts. And that kind of moves me onto my third point, which is social pressures are an extremely powerful tool to manipulate people's actions. Some of the reasoning that these men had for committing these acts were the task was put onto the whole group, and they didn't want to let their comrades down and force their comrades to commit even worse acts. Excuse me, even more acts. Instead, they wanted to, in a horrible phrase, kind of take one for the team, which is a horrible phrase to use in this situation. But because of that, as I said, there's these social pressures which meant that you would comply, and you wanted to kind of do good for your group, which again, it kind of shows that these social pressures are so powerful to make you do these horrendous things. And the next point is that, so they, after they committed these kind of first type of these first executions, it then stepped up and ramped up, and over the course of a year, this battalion were responsible for murdering tens of thousands, more than any other more than any other battalion, tens of thousands of people. And it's interesting because the first time they killed people, they couldn't sleep. It absolutely tore them up inside. Some people were contemplating suicide. Some people were escaping their own police battalion. But a lot of people, and the vast majority of people, in a horrible way, slept on it. And they post-rationalized it. They gave themselves reasons and justifications on why these things should have taken place. And once you've post-rationalized a horrific act, committing it again becomes a very easy, simple thing to do. And so these men turned from these very nice, loving family people to monsters within a short period of time, and continued to commit these horrendous acts, killing tens of thousands of people. And that really leads me on to my final point. And this is so important. It's knowing that we're all capable of doing these things. It's not, these people aren't alien kind of freaks. These are normal people, everyday people, you and I, that can commit these horrendous, most horrific acts. And it's so important that we know that we are capable of doing this, to avoid it, to avoid the events, kind of, anything even remotely similar reoccurring in the future. And so, Andy, that is my 5 things.
Sorry, I was just struggling for the unmute button. Thanks
I'm
so
sorry.
much.
Yeah, I realized it was slightly rambling, but
not at all.
yeah,
It's a really emotional subject and something
just
I'm
going through it. Yeah, just going through it.
Intrigued
Threw
about.
me off.
Are you okay?
Yeah, I'm okay. I'm okay.
Good.
Thank you.
Good. Well, thanks so much for that, Ross. And yeah, it's obviously a very incredibly powerful topic as well. So yeah, if you've got any questions or anything you want to discuss about that, just pop it in the chat. I'm trying to be as cheery as possible after such a somber moment. But we'll move on to our next speaker. Quite a change in topic. But we're going to move on to Olly just now. And Olly is currently co-founder and CTO of Edinburgh Tech Poster Child Free Agent. Is that a good way to describe Free Agent?
Definitely, yeah. Poster child.
Yeah.
Poster child. I'm not sure about child, to be honest. Teenager.
Yeah, poster teenager of the tech scene in Edinburgh. And Olly is kindly going to give us the lowdown on Stephen King's exceptional guide to writing. I read this a while ago on writing. Olly.
Great, thanks very much. Hello, everyone. Thanks for having me. I'm a big 5Things fan. So yeah, delighted and honoured to have the chance to talk. So the book I picked, well, it's by one of the best-selling authors of all time that I'm pretty sure everyone will have heard of. But I don't know whether many people will have heard about this book, which is a bit of a different one, Stephen King. I've read a few of his books before, back in my teens, which is quite a long time ago. And I was a big fan of the books at the time, but I haven't really read a lot of his back catalogue. To be honest, I'm one of those people that gets a bit distracted and hops from author to author and genre to genre, you know. So I haven't really kind of gone through anyone's back catalogue, to be honest. And I suppose, you know, Stephen King is such a good writer. I suppose special shout out to Shawshank Redemption, which I know he wrote, and I think is like one of the greatest movies of all time, but I've never read the book. But if it's as good as a movie, it must be very good. So anyway, on writing, if we go to the next slide, this is a book about a writing masterclass sandwiched in a memoir, is how I've sort of described it. And it starts with this fabulous memoir looking back at his early life, and it's really fantastic. I mean, it's properly laugh out loud. And he's got a wicked sense of humour, and he's obviously such a good writer, and he can just articulate any situation so well. Excuse me. But today, for my 5 things, I'm just going to focus on the masterclass bit, which is a bit in the middle. So I suppose I wanted to read this book for a while, because personally, I'm someone that likes and enjoys the act of writing, but I mainly write emails, documents, presentations, blog posts, and I do wonder, you know, do these count as writing? And I'm not sure in King's world they do. But I suppose if you try and craft these things in some way, then I suppose they are. You know, that is the craft of writing, isn't it? Excuse me. Now, I didn't really read this book because, you know, I wanted to write a novel or short stories and become an author, although I suppose like many people, maybe some of you here, kind of like the idea of that. But to be honest, I don't think I've got the patience, or never mind the talent. But excuse me, early morning. I was going to take a drink of water. So I just thought it'd be an interesting read, and it really is. And I think maybe just a little bit, it's maybe made me a better writer. So if we kind of press on with the first takeaway, one second. Not COVID, sorry. Right, the first thing, if you want to be a writer, you must do 2 things above all others. read a lot and write a lot. And I think writing a lot is probably pretty obvious, isn't it? I mean, it's not really possible to get good at anything unless you practice and put in your 10,000 hours. But the read a lot part isn't so obvious, at least it wasn't to me. And King says he reads 70 or 80 books a year, mostly fiction, and he calls himself a slow reader, which I thought was quite funny because he clearly hasn't met me. You know, I'm trying to read 25 books a year according to my Goodreads challenge, and I'm on track, but it's a bit of a slog. But anyway, I was quite proud of 25. But anyway, but clearly he devours books, and he always has a book on him wherever he is. So if he's excuse me, standing in line at the ball game, he's reading, but he says he doesn't do this to study the craft. He does it because, as he says, and I like to read, I like stories, and if you don't have time to read, you don't have the time or the tools to write, because reading is the creative center of a writer's life. So I really like that. And you know, if you want to be a novelist like him, well, he has a strict reading and writing program, 4 to 6 hours a day, which, you know, if you really enjoy it and have an aptitude for it, then that won't seem too strenuous. So that's how much he does. And he says he's a slow reader, but he also says he's a slow writer. He doesn't think he's prolific, even though he's written 35 books. But then he talks about John Creasy, who's a novelist I've never heard of, apparently wrote 500 books under 10 different names. Then he does question people like Harper Lee. What do they do with the rest of their time? It's like written, well, at the time he wrote this, one book. So anyway, for me, the key takeaway from this point is, really to try and read more books, which basically, well, for me, translates as look at my phone less, I think. So that's what I would say. So on to number 2. This one's common tools go on the top of your toolbox. And so this is an analogy about the toolbox. And if you have an actual toolbox at home, you keep the most common ones at the top, your screwdriver or your Allen key, or whatever. And a writer has their own toolbox, and the most common tool of all, which Stephen King calls the bread of writing, is vocabulary, and that should be at the top of your toolbox. And kind of crucially, you shouldn't make any conscious effort to improve your vocabulary. You don't dress it up looking, for long words because you're ashamed of the small ones. And as he says, and to quote, "This is like dressing up a household pet in evening clothes. The pet is embarrassed, and the person who committed this act of premeditated cuteness should be even more embarrassed." So use the first word that comes into your mind if it's appropriate. And he kind of goes on and says, if you hesitate and cogitate, you'll come up with another word. And of course you will, because there's always another word, but it probably won't be as good as the first one, or as close to what you actually mean. And I think that's really true, isn't it? People have, probably struggled, looked at thesauruses and tried to improve. But to be honest, the one you pick first is probably the one you really mean. And I remember I once read a quote, and I can't remember who it was by or who said it. And it was something along the lines of, if you have to use a thesaurus, you've already lost. And I think that's kind of the same thing. And also it reminds me of that Stephen Wright joke, where he just sounds like, what's another word for thesaurus? Quite like that one. So that's number 2. And number 3 is avoid the passive tense, where he kind of starts getting into grammar, which really isn't my strong point. And I don't know about you, but it doesn't really matter how many times I read or I'm told the rules of grammar, they just don't stay in my head. I don't really understand why, nouns and verbs, I get that, but then pronouns, and I get very confused. But anyway, the takeaway here is that there are 2 types of verbs, active and passive. And active verbs, in the active voice, the subject is doing something, and with passive verbs, something is being done to the subject. And the passive voice, according to King, it's very safe. The subject is just letting it happen. You're kind of closing your eyes and thinking of England or Scotland, maybe, if that translates. So in the passive voice, you might say, the meeting will be held at 7 o'clock. But in the active voice, you'd say, the meeting's at 7, which is much better, right? And if you have 2 pages of the passive voice, which is like any business document ever written, it just makes you want to scream because it's really weak. So I think this is definitely a bit of a call to action. to use the active voice in the business domain as well. I think, you know, it's definitely something I've tried to do without even really knowing it. It's just humanizing the writing is how I think of it. So avoid the passive voice. Number 4 is the road to hell is paved with adverbs, and the adverb is not your friend, according to Stephen King. And well, so grammar rules obviously can't stay in my brain, but an adverb is a word that modifies a verb or an adjective or other adverbs, and they usually end in ly. And the problem with adverbs, according to Stephen King anyway, is when using them, the writer is telling us they're afraid they aren't expressing themselves clearly. So there's a couple of examples he has. For instance, he closed the door firmly, and firmly being the adverb there. And so did he close the door or did he slam the door? You know, firmly, the adverb is redundant. You don't need it. Or another example, if you said, "Put it down," she shouted, or "Put it down," she shouted menacingly. It's weaker, right? There's more impact in the first one. So yeah, adverb tells me, and he, like another analogy, I mean, he's so good. He basically said adverbs are like dandelions, like one on its own can look really pretty and unique, but if you don't root it out, you'll find there's like 5 the next day, and then there's 50, and then you'll see them for what they really are, weeds, which I really like. So on to number 5, which is plot doesn't matter, which I thought was quite a controversial one and a bit of an eye-opener, because I always thought, you know, having never written a book, I always thought authors planned their books meticulously, you know, like J.K. Rowling having known the entire 7-book saga from the beginning. And maybe she did, but according to King, a strong enough situation renders the whole question of a plot moot. And the most interesting situations can usually be expressed as what if questions. So for example, what if vampires invaded a small New England village? And that's the premise of Salem's Lot. Or what if a novelist has an accident and is rescued by a deranged fan? And that's Misery. And it's all about situation. So you pick your situation and you just go from there. And story is, as he says, is honorable and trustworthy. And plot is shifty and best kept under house arrest. So I thought that was really good. And so that's it. Those are my 5 things. And so to summarize, if you want to be a writer, you do 2 things with others: read a lot and write a lot. Common tools go at the top of your toolbox, and the vocabulary is your most common one. Avoid the passive tense. The road to hell is paved with adverbs, and plot doesn't matter. So yeah, I highly recommend this book. It's very good. So yeah, go ahead and read it, and yeah, read more and write more.
Hey, thanks, Ollie. Read more, write more, 100%. So you managed to distill the main points so succinctly, or that was a succinct talk. Is that the active? That's active, isn't it?
Yeah.
Anyway, I'm learning as we go along. Cool. Well, let's mosey on to our last speaker and last book of the day. So Claire is strategy and insight lead at Scottish Government just now, and she's on secondment from Leith, where she's been one of them super smart planners for over 15 years. Is that right, Claire?
Yes.
Something like that, yeah. And she's along the way won a barrel load of Marketing Society Star Awards, including a gold award for the Scottish Government Road Safety Scotland Kids in the Car, which is a fantastic campaign. And Claire is going to tell us all about period today. Period. Yeah.
Exactly that.
Great. Thanks, Claire.
Brilliant. Thank you, Andy. Good morning, everybody. Lovely to be here. Lovely to see you all. Thank you for having me, Andy. So this is a really interesting, tricky subject. Emma Barnett's a journalist. She made broadcasting history when she became the first person on live TV to look into the camera and tell viewers that she had her period. She was chairing a debate about whether companies should offer time off for people having painful periods. She had an extremely painful and, sorry, I know it's early, plotty period at the time, so it was relevant. They came off air and her co-host important to note he was male, lowered his head into his hands and said, "Why, oh why did we need to talk about this, Emma? Guess what year that was?" You can write it in the chat section. Oh, no guesses. I'm disappointed. Okay, well, thank you, Ruth. Good guess, 2010. 2005, wrong, 2016. So if I could have the next slide, Andy, that would be ace. So the book's about periods and why they make people squirm. Emma, not long after her on-screen revelation, was diagnosed with endometriosis after 21 years of debilitating period pain and repeat attempts to tell doctors that she thought something was wrong. She wrote the book to encourage people to be more open to avoid such shenanigans for others. I read it not because I have endometriosis, but as someone fascinated by the fact that this thing happens to just over 50% of us at least once a month. And it doesn't get a whole lot of airtime in the media or in our day-to-day conversation. And I want to know why that is. Next slide, please. Thank you. So if absolutely necessary, before I read this book, I would refer to my time of the month, or a little pet name, my time. There are at least 150 euphemisms in circulation, and Emma lists them in the book. They're wonderful, some of them. Arsenal or Liverpool playing at home, a vampire sandwich, Devil's Waterfall, Mr. Blobby's in town, I guess that's for the clotty ones, riding the cotton unicorn, and then there are awful things, having ketchup with your steak, that'll make you feel a bit squeamish so early in the morning, blowjob week, the one that makes me gag a little bit, on the blob. And then there are global variations. So in America, you might hear the Red Sox have a home game. In Romania, Santa Claus has come. In Turkey, the motherland is bleeding. So why are there so many names? Because Emma concludes it's an uncomfortable topic. It's scarcely portrayed in the media, reinforcing the idea that it shouldn't be talked about. When it is portrayed, it's seen as something horrific. So continuing today's theme, Stephen King's Carrie, for example, an extraordinary example of a period that has catastrophic consequences. There are a couple of scenes in I May Destroy You. If you've seen it, you'll know. These seem to me the way the conversation should be going, but they're the exception, not the rule. And when you need to buy your, things, you'll find them in a chemist or a supermarket in a section called feminine hygiene. But we're not dirty. So it's all around easier if you sweep it under the carpet. Next slide, please. I helped develop a campaign for the Scottish Government, and I think others on this call might have had a hand in this too. So thank you to those too. It ran at the start of 2020, and it was intended to tackle the stigma attached to periods, use the euphemisms as a jumping off point, and works on the principle that if we can't call it by its name, how can we even start to dismantle the stigma? But part of the stigma comes from the fact that periods are a little bit scary. If I could hop onto the next slide, please. Thank you, Andy. So I'm lucky. I don't approach my period with actual fear, though most people with a womb probably remember the first time they glanced at their knickers to see, you what? We're not meant to bleed, right? Lots of us get a little bit swimmy in the head if they get a bad bump and bleed a lot. But many of us bleed a lot once a month from a place where really you might not want to bleed. It's nasty, icky, messy, a total pain in the arse. When I was a teenager, I got such bad cramps that I'd throw up regularly. So I learned the Samaritans were set up by a vicar in 1953 who 20 years before had conducted the funeral of a teenage girl who'd been so frightened when she started her period, she thought she had a sexually transmitted disease, that she killed herself. Periods are a little bit scary. So take the inconvenience, the fact that it's a little bit disconcerting, and then ladle on a heap of prejudices, presumptions, and belittling nonsense, such as, next slide, please. This awesome quote from, take a guess, President Trump, one-time President Trump, of a Fox News presenter who gave him a not very taxing grilling in an interview. I don't want to go all smash the patriarchy so early in the morning, but it's interesting that periods still in this supposedly open-minded society are used as a reason to discredit and dismiss all these people with wombs. But take a minute and search your soul. Have you ever said, in response to a particular display of grumpiness, with a wry, I know better than this, but I'm going to say it anyway, shrug, she must be on her period? I have. According to Emma, in Finland, they call periods mad cow disease. Some of the prejudice, judgments, nonsense is coming from men. Emma devotes several chapters to this in the book, but you're not all bad. Did you know a man invented the tampon? And perhaps the greater problem, Emma notes, is the hushing, blushing, presumptions and assumptions that we menstruating ones bring to the party. The stigma's alive and thriving, and we women are just as much to blame. Slide 4 or thing 4, please, thank you. So Emma's Jewish. Before she married her husband, she was invited to chat with a volunteer at the friendly local synagogue in Bayswater, London, to find out more about getting wed. The volunteer informed her softly and sweetly, adverbs? Anyway, Olly, sorry, I was listening, I did write notes. Anyway, the volunteer informed her softly and sweetly that every month when she bled, she became impure, unclean for her husband. So during this time, she shouldn't touch him. She shouldn't even serve him food. Other cultures and countries take more extreme precautions to avoid people being tainted by our uncleanliness. In Uganda, certain tribes prevent the bleeding women from drinking cow's milk during their time of the month for fear they contaminate the herd. And you'll have heard of chapadi, the huts that women and girls in Nepal have to occupy away from their homes during their period. I read these stories and I consider myself lucky to just have to deal with the inconvenience. But once again, is there part of me that is complicit in this, I wonder? 30 years ago, always, with their super thin pads, didn't exist. Teenage me hadn't figured out tampons. The sanitary towels, they were called, the clues in the name, were bulky, not very absorbent for a period knicker. So, sorry, this is really gross, but you did kind of wallow in your own blood. I remember being really paranoid that I smelt, that everyone at school could tell that I had my period. Fast forward 30 years, and we did research with teenagers and young women to help us develop the campaign I showed you earlier, and found exactly the same thing. Today's too cool for school, picture perfect young women talked about being worried that they smelled when they had their period. So couple that yuck with being told for several days a month that you are a bit yuck, and we wonder why we're not always bursting to lean in. Thing 5, please. So for all that they're a pain in the ass, periods do serve a purpose for some, but some of us might toil through 40 years of monthly gut-wrenching bleeding without a single baby to show for it, because life things don't go your way, because health things don't go your way, because you choose not to, or because you can't. And that's quite a weird thought, because does that mean that all of this mess and all of this disruption was for nothing, for fun? For all the people willing their period to come from one month to the next, willing themselves not to be pregnant, there are a whole lot more people willing their period not to start and experiencing the bone-crushing disappointment when it does. Emma's story ends happily. Her endometriosis is diagnosed, treated, she gets IVF, she gets pregnant. She writes the book in the 3 crazy months after she's given birth to a long, longed for boy. But she's one of the lucky ones. My periods are starting to get a bit bumpy. I'm not sure when I'll become the beautifully badged perimenopausal. Maybe I'm there already. But awaiting a period one month, I had the sudden thought that I'm on the verge of finishing this pain in the ass practice, fangling around for too long in bathrooms, several days a month. Did I feel happy? To my horror, a tiny bit of me felt obsolete. My purpose served on this planet. Me with no intention of trying to birth a child, me who considers herself a feminist, I fleetingly felt redundant. A few days later, my period started. So summing all of that up, and my final slide, thank you, Andy. What does Emma want to take from her book? She finishes it with a manifesto. asking us not to erase them, not to do down women's brutal experiences of periods, but to, and this is a quote, elevate them from the dark underworld of our knickers to normality, so that all people are no longer appalled by periods, and the people that want to can talk about them freely, problems shared and all. Thanks for listening.
Thanks so much, Claire. Ooh. I'm gonna stick there. I'm like sort of like semi-ashamed that, yeah, even I was really interested in what you said before we started the call, Claire, that when you're thinking about doing this book, you yourself felt uncomfortable about sharing that. And you know, if you do,
I still feel uncomfortable.
Yeah, it's nuts, isn't it? And you just listening to you talking there, I also felt uncomfortable and like a bit ashamed that I did as well, for such an everyday thing, and my sort of knowledge of periods being the age I am and father of daughters and whatnot is pretty low. So thanks so much for sharing that. I was just wondering, so it's not quite about the book, but obviously you did look into this for the campaign you released. Was that with the Scottish government? I was wondering if you sort of got any sense of the impact that made.
The campaign?
Yes, sorry, yeah.
It's a good question. We obviously evaluated it, so we knew that people saw it, took what we wanted them to take from it, and we asked them a question about whether or not they would feel, because the tricky thing about this subject is it has so many tendrils and so many different areas of life, and ultimately we want people to feel less bashful talking about it. But just asking that question coldly feels like it's not necessarily going to give you a good, truthful, insightful answer. So one of the things that we asked people was whether or not, after having seen the campaign, they felt more comfortable asking a close family member or friend or someone they worked with for a period product, because women on the call will know. And now in Scotland, things are a little bit different and a little bit easier, because free period products are available in lots of places, which is just a wonderful transformation and phenomenal for lots of people. Can't afford to buy the things that make these things easier to manage and easier to kind of keep moderately tidy. So this move from the government, I don't want to sound evangelical so early in the morning, is really phenomenal for lots of people. But we thought, what's a kind of simple, easy action that the awkwardness attached to periods might translate into for the people seeing this campaign? It was really targeted at kind of 18 to 24-year-olds as the ones that we hoped we could indoctrinate to be more comfortable as they grew older. We did see a tiny movement in people feeling more likely to ask people they knew for a thing if they started their period at work or at school or whatever it might be. So that felt encouraging. But in terms of looking at the actual impact that it would have on the lives of people, young or old, really tricky to know. We know from the research that lots of young people will stay home for several days when they have their periods. They're so uncomfortable. Lots of really sad stories about people not wanting to go out, whether during the day or for nights out or whatever, because they were worried they would leak. Lots of stories about people actually leaking and being excruciatingly embarrassed. One of the things that makes me so interested in the subject is when I was a teenager, one of my friends was mortified. She was at the hairdresser having, this is quite a long time ago, having a perm. So these things took ages for girls. You'd sit in a chair for a long, long time. And she came away from the hairdressers and realized that she'd bled through her trousers onto the beautiful white seat in the hairdressers. And she was mortified. Never went back, of course. Didn't feel she could talk about it to anybody. And you think it's sad that, yes, this is why the campaign, getting a chance to do that campaign meant a lot to me. That's a really rambling answer, Andy, sorry.
No, not at all. I just think it feels like something that needs to change. As you said, the words that you associate, well, it's very explicit in a Kemper and boots or something. It said hygiene, very explicit, and is sort of like, not that I directly associate, but the unclean, impure sort of things must still sort of filter through to our brains, because that's just the way society works, and that's like a massive thing to change, isn't it? So respect to you and the Scottish government, I think we have like made, or it seems to be that we've made inroads into that area recently. I was gonna switch over to go backwards straight to Olly actually. I really enjoyed on writing as well. And I personally picked it up to try and improve my business writing as well. I'm not sure that's what your motivation was, Olly, but yeah, I write a lot in the context of business, and as you say, it's often very dull, difficult to parse, and I don't think that really needs to be the way. But I don't know if that was your motivation or something that has improved your business writing too, Olly.
I think so. I think, you know, in any job, well, any office type job, I suppose, you read a lot of stuff, and it's just not written in a way that's very enticing or very interesting often. And I don't know why that is. I think it's probably because maybe it harks from a time when people had to write in a certain way. We're very professional and we're far less professional now, aren't we? Because you want it to be a bit of fun. You're stuck in work all day. You want to, you know, try and make it a bit more interesting. And if you're reading a document, try and, you know, make it as short as possible. You know, you don't necessarily need to be, you know, dressing it up and making it all, you know, like you would a novel, I suppose. But certainly more light-hearted and less stuffy. It's probably a good thing, I think. No one really wants to read these. They want to get to the point, you know.
I agree. I recommend I personally done a couple of short writing courses. Sort of writing courses that were short, not short writing. And yeah, it's massively massively sort of improved the way I can communicate at work and elsewhere, and yeah, hopefully saves people a lot of time wading through random adverbs and whatnot.
Yeah, it's quite interesting about the thing about the adverbs, because of course you shouldn't avoid them entirely. I think that the point is very much about think about it. You know, like if you're doing this thing, think about it before you use it. You know, because all rules can be broken as well, right? So yeah, it definitely makes you think. It's, you know, about how you approach these things. And I think certainly if, you know, if you did want to write a short story or even something, you know, bigger, then a book like that is definitely would inspire you to kind of just crack on with it and think about situations. And, you know, that's what I took out of it, definitely. It's quite possible, but yeah, definitely read a lot. You know, if you read a lot and you quite like writing, then you're probably going to be pretty good, you know. So
thanks, Olly. There's a question for Barnett, actually, for going back to you, Claire. Yeah, did you interview men or teenage boys for your campaign too?
That's a great question. Heavens, Eve might remember. Eve, who's here too, worked on this with me and did all the actual hard work. But I think that we didn't have the money, but we were really conscious that one of the things that's really awkward, particularly for young women, is navigating relationships. Either, I suppose my circumstances are peculiar because I grew up in a household with my dad, so I was sort of forced into talking about periods because I needed stuff and I didn't have money to buy it when I started. But lots of girls might be living in single parent households or are starting out in relationships with boys, and so the conversation around periods might be something they want to bring up, but can't. So we did talk to them a lot about navigating this conversation, you know, particularly around sex and periods, that lovely stuff. So we were interested in talking to them about that, but I don't think that we did talk to boys. I shan't put Eve so directly on the spot, but if you can remember, Eve, and can write into the chat section if we did do anything with men, that would be ace.
He says that's not true about the work. No, Eve.
We didn't, kids. Thank you, Eve.
No.
I don't want to
But
make
yeah,
her show herself so early in the morning. That's just too much when she just came here to be polite and listen. But thank you, that's helpful. I thought we didn't.
Yeah, I don't know if anyone else. Sorry, I think there. I wasn't sure if that was a question for you, Claire, to Ross. Unfortunately, Ross has had to dip off, but yeah, I was going to explore some of the things that Ross was talking about, especially where the area where ideas become acceptable. I think in politics they sort of call that the Overton window, don't they? And it's sort of a big risk for anyone. But yeah, my key takeaway from that was that it's easy for any ideas to become acceptable if they're like incremental, and you post rationalize that. But yeah, I don't know, Ollie or Claire, if that book, if it prompted any thoughts for you to put you on the spot now that Ross is gone.
No, it did. I'm fascinated by this thought that if I'm really interested in both the world wars, and obviously all sorts of other awful things have happened in lots of places in the world that aren't just world wars. There are all sorts of wars being fought just right now. All sorts of terribleness has happened. But I often think to myself, what would I do? What would I do if I was in Nazi Germany? Would I, if I wasn't Jewish, would I hide Jewish people in my basement or in my attic to save them being taken? Would I shoot people if I was in that police force that he spoke about, and they said you have the choice but you don't actually really have the choice? Would I do these things? And I'm pretty sure I would, because I'm not very brave and I'm pretty sheep-like. And it does make me feel really uncomfortable with myself, because you love to think that you would somehow stand up for what you believe in and be a good person, but I'm just not sure that I would have the courage to do that. So his book, yeah, I'm going to be ordering that up and reading it one day to make myself feel gloomy.
Yeah, I agree. I've been fascinated by the topic of the psychology behind why people do horrific things, and yeah, not to blame them. I think it seems, as Ross said, they're all very innocent to a certain degree, and it seems quite a difficult word to use in that context, to call them innocent after those crimes, but in a sense they've been engineered to do pretty horrific acts. I think it was really helpful for me just to sort of maybe admit you do those things. Oh, so we're waving. I wasn't sure if that was waving at me. So I'm just going to see if we've got any more questions in the chat, or if anyone else feels feel more than welcome to unmute and have a chat about some of the things that we've talked about today. That's a scary thing, isn't it?
Hi, Andy. Hi, everybody.
Hello.
I'm Danit. Firstly, thank you for this fantastic morning. I'm new to this. I didn't know about it until someone referred me. So thanks for that.
Oh, thanks so much for coming, Danit.
Secondly, I think all three subjects today in some way, interestingly for me, brought up, maybe it's just because I've been around a while, the need for early conversation. I think you can address all these subjects from a very young age with the right filters involved on how you present to children, how you bring it up. And my question to Claire about did you ask boys is because we've lived in America years and years and years ago, and that was a subject. And at the start of my business, I used to go and do seminars for women on menopause and period and all of that, being shocked, being Mediterranean myself and then living in all these other places, being shocked that these conversations are not happening, that people are not talking about these things openly, because not only it affects the females or the people with wombs, as you call them, which I like, it affects the other 50% of the society as well, the men, because, they are affected because they either know women, they live with women, they raise women, so it is important. But like with Ross's subject, talking about the other and how important it is to recognize the other in your environment from a very young age, in order to make it an impossibility for us all to make these, to act in a way that is unbearable to even think about and potentially, as he said, we all can. Yeah, these things have to be discussed from a very, very young age with our children, with our friends' children, in schools, in society, in order to make it more of a. So yeah, I just wanted to add this as a common thread, I think.
That's a really interesting addition, Denise. Thanks for that. I think it's funny to work out when does something become taboo in in a person. Definitely isn't taboo when you're 3. If you've been around 3 or 4 year olds, they don't care about what they talk about what they talk about. But yeah,
and they only want an answer with children, especially from my experience at least. They only want the dotted answer. They're not interested in the whole complex story. So if you can do this, and as Andy said, in small bites and use the right words to make it a clear point across, then they don't want to know all the rest. They just need an answer to their question. And as we know, they're full of questions. So we kind of encourage that and have the conversation.
What we saw with periods was this research that we did just in 2020. It's interesting because you think schools are better with this subject now, and maybe parents are more open, parents or carers are more open and more willing to talk about these things with their young people. But the kids that we talked to in the research spoke about having received the lesson at the tail end of primary school, because lots of kids, if you have younger kids, you'll know kids are starting to navigate periods now from kind of 9, 10, 11, which is slightly mind-blowing. I think I was about 13 or 14 before I had to worry about it. But as a consequence, at the tail end of primary school, they tend to get a lesson. But what the young people in the research that we did said was that the boys and the girls are separated out for this lesson. So the girls get a version of the story and the boys get a version of the story that doesn't really touch on periods. And obviously, if they're 9 or 10 years old, they're not going to talk about the menopause, poor things. So much to look forward to. They don't need to know yet. But it's interesting to think that the stigma is sort of starts to be kind of bedded in at, just as you say, at a really young age. And if we could be smarter in how we dealt with that, you can't help feeling that would make a real difference.
I wouldn't recommend my approach, which was, and my kids are not here and they're grown now, they have their own businesses, their lives, but I was the only parent in the school when we came to Scotland at that stage, when they arrived at that stage, who went to the school and asked to see the tape, the VHS tape, to see what the kids are learning. My kids were mortified. They haven't spoken to me, but yeah. So I wouldn't recommend that to embarrass your children, but maybe there's a different way you could do this.
There's a really nice story in the book. Emma talks about how her mum was obsessed with not ensuring that her child didn't feel uncomfortable talking about periods or having a period. And so she remembers starting her period when she was out in a department store with her mum, and called her from the toilet that she thought that something was awry, and they discussed it and established that her period had started, but neither of them had any products to mop her up. So her mother apparently ran through the department store shouting, celebrating that her daughter had started her period, demanding whether or not the other customers in the store had got any products that she could give to her lucky daughter who had started her adult womanhood, and so as a consequence she has always been very you can see how the book came from this. As a consequence, she's always been very comfortable thinking and talking about the subject matter. And you think if more people had mothers or fathers like this, then that could be a really good thing too.
Well, hopefully we can make inroads. I think it'd be a really nice thing to see change. Definitely not be taboo, or it's just crazy, isn't it? It's sort of processing all this information just now. Well, unfortunately, we have come to the end of our hour. I very much enjoyed that, and I think all this is for me. Actually, I learned a ton of a ton of things in this hour, and then spend the rest of the day trying to process it. So, yeah, just a final round of applause for our 3 speakers. It was wonderful. Thank you so much, and thanks everyone for coming along today as well. I'll pop a link in the chat. We'll do this thing again in December. I'll put the tickets up, registration up just now if you fancy joining 15th of December. But yeah, that's all for today, folks. So we'll have a swell rest of Wednesday, and yeah, hope you are indeed motivated to get one of those books, or even if you pick something up today. I think that's probably an hour well spent.